You're gonna have to be good and quiet. A few weeks ago, I made a post recommending books to very early readers, like babies and young kids. I was recommending fantasy books that you can give to children to introduce them to the fantasy genre so they can eventually grow up to be part of the fantasy reading army that we all want to see in the next generation. Well, today I am going to be continuing on with this series, and I will be recommending middle grade fantasy books to your young readers. Now, this is a pretty narrow age group, so I don't have a ton of books recommended for this, so this will be a pretty quick video. I'm going to kick off by recommending Garth Nix because he was kind of a staple of my childhood. Now, most of Garth Nix's works I would recommend to a slightly older audience, probably about 13 to 15, but I feel like the Seventh Tower series would be ideal for younger readers between 8 and 11 or 12. It is a pretty easy read. There are 6 books in it. I kind of figured there should be 7 because it's called the Seventh Tower series, but there are 6 books in this series by Garth Nix, and they're all relatively quick reads, but they do follow some slightly convoluted fantasy plot lines that serve as a good introduction to how impressive fantasy can actually be once you get to some of the older stuff. So I would really recommend this to probably about 8 or 9 years old, maybe 10. There's not really any dark content in these stories, but they are also simultaneously at least a little bit dark. So I wouldn't really recommend reading this to somebody who's like 6 or 7, but once an 8 or 9 year old is able to read on their own, these would be some pretty good introductory books. I don't really know what I would compare it to. It's kind of a mix of Pokemon and Red Rising. It doesn't have all of the violence and gore of Red Rising, but it does have the color-based caste system. And the Pokemon thing comes from the fact that they bind these creatures from another plane to themselves, and then in the real world, these creatures that they bind to themselves are essentially their shadows. I believe they replace their shadows, but it has been a long time since I read these books. I just remember really loving them and burning through them. The unfortunate thing about this series is that because it is so short, there are only 6 books and each book is pretty small, your reader is probably going to burn through this series in a month or less, especially if they are a fast reader. The good news is that Garth Nix has a massive library of works. He has a huge collection of books for children and young adults, and I would recommend picking up the Keys to the Kingdom series next. It's a little bit longer, the books are a little bit thicker and a little more challenging, so if they enjoyed the Seventh Tower and they want the next step up, Keys to the Kingdom is a great series. Next, I'm going to be recommending Bruce Colville. I have mentioned Bruce Colville a couple of times on this channel so far because he was my favorite author who I consider to be a gateway drug to Terry Pratchett, which I believe is the highest compliment that you could ever pay to a person besides saying, hey, you're Terry Pratchett. He's just a great person who apparently is okay with children emailing him constantly because that is what I did for a good while. He, like Garth Nix, has an incredibly vast library of books, so if your reader enjoys the books that I'm about to recommend, they are almost definitely going to find more Bruce Colville books that they really enjoy. But I will specifically be recommending the Magic Shop books by Bruce Colville to your reader. This is something I would say you should probably be closer to about 10 or 11 years old to read, not because the themes are more mature, but because the books are a little bit more challenging to read than I would say Seventh Tower is. So maybe a little bit older, 10 or 11, before you pick up the Magic Shop books. There are, I believe, 4 books in the Magic Shop series, and they began being released in the 90s and went on to, I think, 2003 is when the final novel was launched. These all follow the same theme, but they have different characters in each of the stories. The plot, essentially, for each of the books is a kid has a problem and they stumble into a magic shop. They walk in there, and there's all sorts of different trinkets that are magical and powerful and have all of these different abilities. Think if you were playing a game of D&D and your DM had an emporium filled with every possible magic item from Xanathar's Guide to Everything. It is a plethora of incredible magic devices, and the child always happens upon the one that can help them in that particular situation. Take, for example, the first book in the series, The Monster's Ring, in which a kid who is being chased by a bully picks up a ring that allows him to turn into a monster, and they only get better from there. My personal favorite one is Jeremy Thatcher Dragon Hatcher, which, as you can guess, is about a kid who stumbles into the magic shop and buys a dragon egg, which then hatches. These are fantastic stories. They are a lot of fun. Bruce Colville is a great author, and if your child enjoys Bruce Colville, they are almost definitely going to end up like me, somebody who really loves Terry Pratchett. And speaking of Terry Pratchett, you didn't think I was going to continue on with this series without recommending yet another Terry Pratchett book to your young reader, did you? So yes, my next recommendation is a Terry Pratchett book, but before I get to that, I wanted to remind you can like, comment, and subscribe, all at no cost to you, and all of which really help me to grow the channel, so I appreciate you taking the time to do that. And now my Terry Pratchett recommendation is The Amazing Maurice and His Educated Rodents. This is a really fun Discworld novel, so it will most likely be your child's first Discworld novel that they read, because I believe it is the only novel that takes place in the Discworld setting that is intended for a younger audience. Now, I would say you probably want to be a little bit closer to 12 before you pick this book up, but even as an adult, I still really love this story. It is a super well-told Pied Piper retelling set in Terry's story. The Pied Piper is a con man, and he and Maurice, along with their educated rodents, go from town to town, pretend that it's plagued with rats by sending all of their educated rodents all over the town to plague it and terrify everybody, and then the Pied Piper will offer his services to get the rats out of town, and then he will take the rats to another location, and they will repeat the scam again, constantly getting paid by these places to rid it of the mice that they themselves infested the town with. It's a pretty unique scam. It's a lot of fun, and I really like this take on the Pied Piper. Alright, and now on to my final recommendation, which might come as a surprise to some of you, but to many of you, especially if you are around my age, you've probably read this series before. It is going to be John Flanagan's The Ranger's Apprentice. I think starting this series at about 9 or 10 years old is a pretty good point at which to begin reading these books. That's about when I started. I may have even started a little bit older. John Flanagan's The Ranger's Apprentice follows typical fantasy tropes, especially the common trope that you see of the naming day or the choosing day or whatever you want to call it, that is really prevalent, especially in young adult novels, where somebody who can't find their place has their place assigned to them, and a lot of them end up being different. That is the case for our main character in this book, who, unlike everybody else, is assigned to somebody he really doesn't want, and he's assigned to be a ranger, because he's so different, much like every single YA protagonist. But the books are still a lot of fun, they're really well written, and they are a pretty good introduction to what fantasy tropes can be, while still being a fun story. It is well written, it takes you along for the ride. I believe that the main series is finished now with its full 12 books, so if your reader picks it up and enjoys it, they are going to be able to carry through to the end of the series and to see how the story pans out. But I remember really loving these books when I was younger, and I think that they are a really strong recommendation for people who are about maybe 11 or 12 years old. And those are my middle grade recommendations for introductory fantasy stories. And as you can tell, I'm very partial to making sure that the child in your life wants to read Terry Pratchett, because maybe then they could join my Discworld read-along, which would be pretty awesome, because it is going to take us a couple of years to get through the entirety of Discworld. Get them reading Bruce Coville, which is the gateway drug, and then get them reading some Terry Pratchett. Thank you so much for taking the time to check out this video. I really appreciate it. If you would like to see another video from me, you can do so by clicking up here. And until next time, bye. I am not getting up because Suba is on my lap. So I'm just stuck here.